Recently, I've noticed some discontent with Regulation G, and we're going to talk about why that is. So, Regulation G is the first restricted format of Scarlet and Violet. It is a very different format from things that we've had before because of the powerhouse Pokemon that we have available to us, right? These Pokemon are doing massive damage at any given time and just blowing through a lot of the competition that previously was very, very good. And I feel for that reason is why we see a lot of the sentiment online, whether it be people in my Discord that I've talked about regarding this, where they just don't feel as engaged with Regulation G, or if it's because, they just can't figure the format out as far as team building goes. There's a lot of reasons that this is a very controversial format. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's pretty standard, especially for the restricted formats. A lot of people, especially if this is your first game in restricted format, it can be very overwhelming with these powerhouse Pokemon. I know I felt the same way when I got into VGC back in Sword and Shield, and I got to my first restricted format and I was like, what am I doing? Why are these Pokemon so strong? Why am I just getting deleted? It's just a format that is very, very difficult, and I don't think that a single restricted format helps this any. I think it's because it becomes very centralized around a very particular Pokemon in that particular playstyle. Looking at things like the 5 that I have on screen here: Zamazenta, Terapagos, Miraidon, Calyrex, whether it be Ice Rider or Shadow Rider. You kind of have a set game plan with these Pokemon, and they just do massive amounts of damage. And it also limits, the fact that you can't bring another one of these Pokemon. So other Pokemon that could be good, one that immediately comes to mind is Lunala, that has seen some success, just not a ton, that could be good in a double restricted format, just isn't seeing a ton of play in the single restricted format. So it does make it feel more limited, more centralized than normal. However, I don't think that this is necessarily the case. The thing about restricted formats is it actually makes certain Pokemon that previously had lower usage rates or really never played in general have so much more room to shine. And I think you're seeing that pop up a lot in Regulation G, where certain Pokemon that really never saw play are starting to pop up here and there and have success. Not only are they just popping up, but they're actually working well in the format, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So over on Labmos, just to name a few of the Pokemon that are popping up, we have things like Cornerstone Ogerpon here. Cornerstone Ogerpon is the Ogerpon form that I feel was the least used in previous regulations. Ogerpon has always been a good Pokemon, and all the forms were usable to their own level of success, but it really never shined as far as Ogerpon went. You mainly saw Hearthflame Ogerpon, or you mainly saw Wellspring Ogerpon having the most success, but Cornerstone has kind of become the Ogerpon of choice on a lot of teams in Regulation G, which is really interesting. Pelipper is one that is a lower tier Pokemon, but just seems to do so incredibly well in Regulation G. It's not that Pelipper was bad before. Pelipper has done very well in previous formats, but it just seems to have gotten even better in this regulation because of the tools that it has at its disposal. A lot of the restricted Pokemon have access to spread moves and are able to just do massive damage in that way. So having Pelipper with a wide guard is even better than it used to be, because mainly you were carrying wide guard in the past for things like Fluttermane with Dazzling Gleam and things like that did a lot of damage, don't get that twisted, but just didn't hit quite as hard as something like a Terra Starstorm or like an Astral Barrage or a Glacial Lance. So Pelipper has just become an even better option in this format. Galarian Moltres saw some play in previous formats, but not a ton, and now it's winning tournaments, right? That's kind of crazy. We also have Latios coming up on certain teams, a Pokemon that previously, didn't see a ton of play and is just doing massive work in the format. And again, winning tournaments. It's kind of crazy. Looking further onto this list, there's other Pokemon that are popping up here and there that, previously didn't have a ton of use, but are starting to show their worth. Things like Gastrodon makes a lot of sense. Kyogre is still very powerful, even though it's not maybe the top restricted Pokemon. Does a lot of work. Surging Strike, Rapid Strike, that's the one. Rapid Strike Urshifu, I kept wanting to say Surging Strike Urshifu. Rapid Strike Urshifu is still incredibly popular. You're seeing it on a ton of the top teams here, and it's still very popular. So having access to Storm Drain is incredibly solid for dealing with that threat. You're just seeing these lesser used Pokemon. Araquanid is another perfect example of a Pokemon that, while previously was strong, was just a Pokemon that you weren't seeing a ton of in the formats. And now with the new wide guard, viability, you're seeing stuff that has wide guard and can be used pretty effectively with wide guard pop up more and more. Looking at this is like a balanced Trick Room team, and it's doing incredibly well. So there's just these Pokemon that, because of this, are just popping up left, right, and center. So looking at some of these Pokemon, like I mentioned, Pelipper is incredibly solid, not only because of the fact that, you know, it gets access to Wide Guard, but Pelipper is actually a really powerful Pokemon in its own right. It has a base 95 special attack stat. You can definitely buff that up. It gets access to Drizzle. This enables things like Urshifu Rapid Strike. It enables Tornadus. If you're running both on the same team, you can immediately click Bleak Wind. It gives you that option to set the rain and help other Pokemon, like you're seeing it on a lot of Zamazenta teams, and that makes a lot of sense because Zamazenta weak to fire. You know, you're able to immediately lower one of your weaknesses in that regard, and also have access to Wide Guard to allow your Zamazenta to set up. There's a lot this Pokemon was doing. On top of that, just having access to powerful attacks like Weather Ball and Hurricane is really powerful. You know, seeing things like Incineroar be as popular as they are in the restricted formats, or Rillaboom be as popular as they are, having access to Hurricane and Weather Ball deals with both of those threats very effectively, also deals with Amoonguss very effectively. Just a ton of damage can be done by Pelipper by itself, and it's not just a support Pokemon in the format. Running things like Focus Sash, running things like Rocky Helmet, it's just a very good Pokemon in this format. Another one that you never see use of outside of restricted formats is Mienshao. This Pokemon, very powerful in its own right, very fast, very powerful, hits very hard with its close combats, does a ton of damage, also has access to Inner Focus, so it can't be intimidated and can't be flinched. Very useful in that regard, but also having access to things like Fake Out, Wide Guard, also having access to other useful tools like Close Combat to deal big damage. Having access to Feint to break through a Protect or a Wide Guard. Lots of things that this Pokemon does in this format that really benefits the teams that it's sitting on. Latios, seeing play. It's kind of crazy that Latios is seeing some really solid use here, but makes sense if we look at the team that was rocking Latios. Let's see if I can find it here. You know, just being a big powerhouse of a Pokemon with also some access to some speed control with like Luster Purge, with the buff to Luster Purge, that's doing a ton for your team. Draco Meteor hitting really hard into things like Miraidon, really solid in that regard. And then just having Icy Wind to give you that kind of coverage, really good in the format. And you're seeing it pop up. Like I mentioned earlier, Moltres is seeing played. Not even the traditional Moltres that you're seeing with like a Citrus Berry to proc Berserk when it gets below half. You're seeing it just go for as much damage as possible, much in the same way that we use like King Gambit, where we're just going for all that dark damage and dishing out a ton with this. It's Terra Dark with Fiery Wrath, Foul Play, and Tailwind with the black glasses. It just is there to nuke things. And it's very interesting to see these developments in Pokemon that, like I said, might have had some use cases in previous formats, but never really popped off. And to see them finally come in and do just significant work in the format is crazy. Going back to Showdown, Ogerpon, like I mentioned, this is not the Ogerpon that was most popular in previous formats, but having access to Sturdy just outright and being able to use Sturdy, and not only do that but pair it with another Focus Sash Pokemon and have two Pokemon that take minimum of 2 hits to KO while also being able to do big damage with Ogerpon itself. Very, very powerful. It's just incredibly strong. It's really nice for Trick Room teams because you're guaranteed to get the Trick Room. You can follow me, you have Sturdy. Even if they take you to the Sturdy, you take you to 1 HP, you're able to take the other hit and get your Trick Room up and get something else more effective in. That is incredibly powerful in its own right, but also just having that redirection capability for things like Miraidon. You know, Ogerpon Cornerstone won Indianapolis Regionals, and this thing has access to the Follow Me, allowing your Miraidon to be pretty much untouched by anything other than spread moves and just do a ton of damage while this thing sits and eats hits. It redirects Amoonguss. You know, it just kind of stops a lot of issues in the format. And with that Sturdy ability, if you have Amoonguss and something else on that side of the field, Amoonguss is pretty much neutralized that turn. It's not doing anything, so that's incredibly powerful in that regard. Gastrodon, like I said, Gastrodon pops up a lot in the restricted formats because it makes a lot of sense. Kyogre traditionally has always been incredibly powerful in the restricted formats, so having that Pokemon with Storm Drain to be able to absorb the Water Spout and save your team from that kind of damage, but also with Rapid Strike Urshifu being as good as it is, being able to just simply absorb the Surging Strikes is incredibly good. Gastrodon popping back up, you saw it a ton in previous formats with things like Groudon. It was on a ton of Groudon teams in Sword and Shield. It's just a good Pokemon that really seems to shine the most in these restricted formats when these big powerhouses come out and start doing a ton of damage. And for that reason, you know, we see Gastrodon making a sort of resurgence. I think it'll be even greater going into a double restricted format after Regulation G. But this Pokemon, you know, we saw it pop up here and there in previous formats, but it never really popped off. This Pokemon, I think, is going to become even more significant going into a double restricted format moving on in Scarlet and Violet. And then again, Araquanid, a Pokemon that was good. I've used it, you know, in previous formats. It does a lot of damage with Water Bubble and Terra Water. It's just a crazy powerful Pokemon, but also having access to Wide Guard, this thing just gets crazy. It does so much for your team. So in that regard, also with, you know, the success of Pelipper, having both of those on a Trick Room team is actually pretty good because Pelipper's speed is kind of trash. So having these two Pokemon on the same team, boosting it with the Rain, having a Rain Room team is really powerful. So you're seeing this thing pop up, and it just does a ton of damage, even if it's resisted. Liquidation with Terra Water, Water Bubble, and Rain is just deleting things. It is so freaking powerful, and this thing is relatively slow. So being able to just kind of do a ton of damage and let this thing, you know, eat hits for your team. It's got pretty decent defensive stats, and you don't really have to invest in anything other than your HP and your attack stat. This thing is crazy good. So you're just seeing these like lesser used Pokemon pop up left, right, and center, because of the fact that, you know, these certain Pokemon that we are using now, looking at, you know, the restricteds, are benefiting from these lesser used Pokemon. These Pokemon are filling a niche in the format better than a lot of the other Pokemon were previously. Like another one that, you know, saw use but never really saw a ton of play, that is now picking up is Whimsicott. Whimsicott is a great Pokemon. There's nothing wrong with Whimsicott, but it really never saw a ton of success in previous formats. But now going into Regulation G, this is benefiting certain teams better than Tornadus is, and being able to, you know, encore things, go for Tailwind, just having access to a lot of things, and then also having a powerful Moonblast at its disposal. This Pokemon is actually kind of nuts. It does so much for a team. So you're seeing this actually also won Indianapolis Regionals. You're seeing Pokemon that, you know, while still good, are popping up more and more in this format. So I think that you have to kind of, going into Regulation G, as we continue with the format, think about some Pokemon that maybe necessarily weren't as popular in previous formats, weren't as good, and are now having some use cases because of the tools that they have at their disposal. I think another one that, you know, is seeing a resurgence a little bit, Ting-Lu. Ting-Lu's seen some play again. Ting-Lu, very good in previous formats. In Regulation C, it was really good, and then it kind of fell off the face of the earth. But with all of these powerful special attackers coming in Regulation G, this Pokemon has seen a huge resurgence. Actually, I won't say huge. It's seen a resurgence. It's popping up on teams here and there. It helps with the Shadow Rider matchup. It helps with the Terapagos matchup. Just a really solid Pokemon. Another one, Iron Valiant. This Pokemon was never touched previously. It just didn't do anything previously. It's a really fast Pokemon, really powerful Pokemon, but because of, you know, how it played, it just wasn't that great. But now we have access to Miraidon, and we need Wide Guard, and Wide Guard is a move that Iron Valiant gets. You have access to the Quark Drive boost from Miraidon, and being able to just dish out some damage and Wide Guard stuff makes this Pokemon dramatically better than it was in the past. I don't think it's like top tier, but it is a Pokemon that has seen some play and seen some success. Another Pokemon, it's just crazy, Iron Jugulus. Garbage Pokemon. It really wasn't that good previously. There were, I think it was Regulation C, there was a team that had Iron Jugulus that won a regional, and that was really the only time you ever saw success with this Pokemon. I think Wolfie and one of Wolfie's friends, I don't remember the name of the player, and I apologize, did very well. Wolfie didn't win, but the other player did win a regional with the exact same team featuring Iron Jugulus. And this Pokemon, while it has minor success in the past, just never traditionally been that good because it's not that powerful of a Pokemon. But now that we're in a restricted format and we have these powerful Pokemon that can be paired next to it, this is seeing a lot of success with Booster Energy, right? And the biggest thing with this is, as far as your Flying Stab goes, you don't really have a ton of options, right? You got Acrobatics, Air Slash, Dual Wing Beat, Hurricane, Tailwind, so not a ton of options, right? So, but now with the access to things like Kyogre, you're able to run that Hurricane and be that much more powerful. You lead this with the Kyogre, you set the Tailwind, you're able to go for Hurricanes and do big damage. And then for those powerful special attackers, the same reason Ting-Lu's so good, you drop Snarl on this thing and then Protect. and this thing does incredible work for a team. And it is just seeing so much more play because of the fact that these restricteds are now in play, and it actually is filling a role for your team. So that's kind of the point that I'm getting at, is despite the fact that Regulation G feels like there's a problem and feels like there is so much flatness to the format and that these Pokemon are kind of like dominating, there is so much spice and variety that you can use as far as team building goes that can still have a lot of success. So you kind of have to look and pick and choose what Pokemon that you maybe wouldn't have looked at before in previous formats could actually fill a really cool and unique role in this format. So that's what I really wanted to talk about today, because it's a conversation that's popped up a handful of times in my Discord and stuff that I see on Twitter. People just really dislike this format. I think this format's fun. Personally, I think it's a very interesting format. Not as fun as what a double restricted format would be in my opinion, but it is still a very fun format to see a lot of these Pokemon like Iron Jugulus make a return. So that's my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Sub if you're not already for more videos like this in the future, and check out the Discord if you want to be a part of the conversation, or if you want to share Regulation G teams that'll be featured in future videos. But until next time, peace.